Okay, everyone. Thanks for coming to my poster. And today I'm going to talk to you about aiming and how it measures explicit motor adaptation. We're interested in this because it forms a proper context for most of the work in our lab, which is about implicit motor adaptation. And as has become increasingly clear lately, implicit and explicit motor adaptation exist in some sort of continuum. They have to be combined in some way to produce motor output. In particular, we are interested in what adding an aiming response does to the way people adapt to a rotation. By asking people to think very hard about in which direction they're going to move their hand relative to a target, this might be the same way as telling them what the perturbation is and how to counter for it. So we did an experiment on this, where we have one group of participants who does aiming before every trial. And we have another group that we do give an instruction telling them about the rotation and how to counter it. And we have a control group that does neither of these things. So in all of the three of these groups, we do a process dissociation procedure where we have no cursor reaches with open loop movements, where we ask people to either include or exclude their strategy by either trying to move as if they were getting the cursor to the target or as if they were getting their hand to the target. We used 8 radial targets, and then for the aiming group, they got an arrow before actually reaching, and they could use the arrow keys on their keyboard to indicate the direction of their hand movement. We started off with a light training with some interspersed no cursor reaches as a baseline measurement. And then we introduced a 30-degree rotation, which is fairly modest, but should work for our purposes. And then we have these PDP no cursor reaches where people either, let's say, include the strategy and then also exclude the strategy, and the order was counterbalanced across participants. Let's look at behavior. In the control group, in yellowish orange everywhere, we see a very typical learning curve. The instruction group starts out at 20 degrees because they got an instruction and applied it, and then the aiming group in purple is very similar to the control group. And then we also have the aims for the aiming group, and these are a little bit lower than in other paradigms, but at the end of the first training bout, they have significant aims of just about 4 degrees. Okay, so let's look at the process dissociation procedure, no cursor reaches. I want to compare these to the level of adaptation at the end of the first training bout, which is the same for all groups. And then we look at the exclude strategy reaches, which should measure implicit learning, and that is also the same in all groups, which is in line with some other research that says that implicit learning is capped at a given level. Okay, so in a lot of papers, we see this assumption that if you try to reach from some point to a target, then part of that is given by aiming or your explicit adaptation or strategy. And then we add on to this implicit components, and that's how you get adaptation. Or in other words, if we were to subtract the implicit learning from total adaptation, we would get the explicit component. But as you see here, that will be the same for all groups. So instead, we are going to look at the include strategy, no cursor reach directions. For the control group, these are somewhat different, but only barely from implicit reaches. For the instructed group, these are very different, and the aiming group is somewhat in between. So I'm going to use the difference between include and exclude strategy in all groups as a measure of explicit learning for now. I will use aiming later on. So that's what we see on the y-axis here, include minus exclude. And then for the no cursor, for the control group, we see that they're very close to 0. For the instructed group, they are around 16 degrees of explicit learning, and the aiming group is kind of in between, and not much higher than the control group actually. But now we take a little bit of a better look at the distributions within the group. So for the control group, we see that almost all participants are very close to 0, that is, they learn implicitly. For the instructed group, the distribution is a bit wider, but there is one clear peak at around 15, 16 degrees, which shows that they have a strategy. And the aiming group looks a little bit differently. They can be split into two subgroups. So about 2/3 of people do not learn explicitly at all. They respond the same as the control group does, and then 1/3 of participants look as if they're in the instructed group. Okay, so now we also want to see if this PDP measure is comparable to aiming at all, if they tap into the same process. So I'm going to show here, only for the aiming group, obviously, the same measure of include minus exclude strategy, but now over the aiming direction at the end of training, the last 8 trials. Okay, and here's the individual data, a unit line, and a regression, which is highly significant. So these two measures do tap into the same process and could be used interchangeably. Of course, each has their own advantages. But let me reiterate the main finding here. For about 1/3 of people, aiming acted as if they got an instruction, but had no effect on the other participants. All right, I'll stop here, and I'm happy to talk about all of this later on. Thank you so much.